Hey everyone, welcome to our second video in Philosophy 106 World Religions. Good to see you again. And in this little video, I want to accomplish two things with you. I want to continue, tracing the threads that we started to discover together in the first video and think a little bit more deeply about the origin of religion and its ultimate purpose. Like, why is there religion, right? Why did we cook this beautiful multi-layered series of systems that cover the whole globe, that interact with ultimate reality, that help us build rituals and community and all the stuff we thought about before? So that's one of the things I want to accomplish in this video. Think more deeply about the origin of religion. And then the second thing I want to do is think about five kind of prominent answers to that question, five prominent theorists and their theories about the origin and the purpose of religion, guys like Freud and Jung and Frazer, and we'll get to that in a minute. And that's going to lead to our discussion this week. Our discussion prompt has to do with these five theories on the origin and purpose of religion that we're about to get into. So let's get started. So when did religion begin? It's easy to answer that question. We have no idea. I mean, we really just don't know. Think about it. The art of writing is, in the scale of time, brand new technology. It's about 5,000 years old, right? About 3,000 BC in the Middle East and in various other places around the world, here in the New World and in China also, at different times. Brilliant people figured out how to create a system of signs and symbols called writing. Cuneiform in Sumeria, right, was a wet clay tablet and a triangular stick that they pressed down into it to keep agricultural records and tax records and so on. And as soon as writing was invented, people started writing poetry and hymns and ritual and history and philosophy. And so with the invention of writing, of course, humankind's knowledge about itself exploded. And you and I can go back and find some of those earliest written records and kind of get a sense of what those people were thinking. But before 3000 BC, it's just a blank. All we have is their artifacts, their cave art. Some of the most famous cave paintings in the world are from 20,000 years ago. And there are lots of Stone Age sculptures scattered around the world, almost 90% of them female figures that go back as far as 100,000 years. What do they mean? We don't have any way of exactly knowing, but I think there's a growing body of evidence that those female figures had sacred significance. There's another clue that we find in the ancient world, in the primordial prehistoric world, that might help us address this question: when did religion, or at least religious thinking, begin? And it's ritual burials. About 100,000 years ago, we see for the first time hominids, Neanderthals, in fact, not even Homo sapiens, not even our species, Neanderthals doing ritual burial, burying their dead in specific poses with expensive and elaborately beaded vests and tools and medicine bags, and as if they're prepared for a journey. And before that, where do you find the human remains? In the midden pile, in the garbage dump outside the village site, with the fish bones and the broken pottery, and there's grandma. But something shifted about 100,000 years ago. Neanderthal and later Homo sapien began to do ritual burials. And think about it, that suggests something, doesn't it? That suggests that they must have began to realize or speculate that when the body dies, the spirit or the soul kind of goes on a journey to an invisible plane. And so in a way, this is the beginning of one of the great archetypes or universal ideas in all religion and mythology, namely that there is an invisible plane of reality hidden from us by the visible plane. And that invisible plane is understood to be superior to, and the source of the visible plane. Are you with me? So the sensory world, the physical world, is the visible plane. And it seems that ancient people, and we see this in all mythologies and religions today, it seems that about 100,000 years ago, these ritual burials indicate to us that these people began to maybe wonder about this, that is there an invisible realm hidden from us by the visible realm, from which spirits come and to which spirits go. They take form, they take corporeal, physical form here in the world, and then when they die, the spirit goes back, animals and people. This is, again, just our speculation. Why else would they do these ritual burials? So that's a starting point for us. Maybe we see, as long as 100,000 years ago, the beginning of religious consciousness or religious thinking. Now let's turn to these 5 prominent theorists that come from fields like anthropology and psychology and theology. The first one I want to think about with you is James Frazer. And again, the discussion prompt this week, I'm going to ask you, which of these 5 theories do you agree with the most, or gets the closest to what you think the origin and purpose of religion might be? So here we go. James Frazer, 1854 to 1941. He was a Scottish anthropologist. He made a very careful study of world mythology and religion. In fact, he wrote one of the great books about world mythology called The Golden Bough, B-O-U-G-H, Bough. Kind of a survey of world myth, one of the first guys to do that. But Frazer argued that religion probably began as an attempt to influence or control nature. We see that in primal religions around the world, in shamanistic, primal, tribal religions. The spiritual teacher of the tribe, the shaman, is often charged with that job of protecting the warriors in battle, or weakening the warriors of the other guys, or making it rain, or making it stop raining, or curing diseases, and, influencing nature. And so Frazer's, I think, making a reasonable presumption here that it does seem to be the case, and there's a lot of evidence for this, that spirituality and religion maybe did originate from our attempts to influence nature. Frazer also argues that religion is kind of an intermediate step between the earlier and even more primitive magical thinking and what Frazer calls, the scientific age that's coming. So the evolution of humankind from magical thinking to religious thinking to scientific thinking. And that one day, Frazer postulates, we will outgrow religion as we finally figure out how things actually work. So let's turn to our second guy, and that's Sigmund Freud. And I bet this is the one name on the list that most of you are familiar with, especially if you're a psychology major. Freud, kind of a big deal, right? So Freud lived from 1856 to 1939, and he's, of course, a towering figure in the field of psychology, one of the patriarchs of psychology, along with William James, who's also on this list. So Freud comes out of the medical field. He's a medical doctor. He's a physician. And he's also an atheist and a materialist. And so we know what an atheist means, right? He denies the existence of God. And he's a materialist, and that often goes together with atheism. Materialism is the philosophical position that reality is just matter. So there's no soul, there's no consciousness, there's no God. What we call consciousness is just an activity of our physical form. It's a biological event. So anyway, Freud's not a fan of religion. He wrote one little thin, tiny book about religion. It's called The Future of an Illusion. So here's Freud's take on religion, that it's nonsense, that it's a form of group neurosis, that it's easier to be crazy together in churches and mosques and synagogues than it is to be crazy off by ourselves. So we find people who share our particular brand of neurosis, and we bind together around made-up ideas like the idea that there is a God. And Freud argues that our belief in God is kind of a coping mechanism that arises from our earliest childhood experiences. And belief in God for Freud is then a projection of those first imprinted experiences. When we were born, Freud argues, think about it, we come out of the womb, we're helpless, vulnerable, weak. We can't even move our hands to our mouth to feed ourselves. Human infants are very vulnerable. Other animals, they drop a baby, the baby just gets up and walks away. But we, human beings, are very dependent on our parents for 20, 30, 40 years sometimes. So that's how it often is with higher order mammals, that they have a longer childhood, longer state of dependency. So when we are born, and Freud's right about this at least, it's pretty scary. We absolutely depend for our survival on the people around us, on our parents. And Freud argues that imprints us. We learn two things fundamentally as infants right away. One, that adults love us and they care for us and they feed us and they keep us warm and they sing little songs to us and they protect us. And two, they're huge and scary and crazy and they could kill us at any second. So it's simultaneously comforting and terrifying. And Freud argues we bring those twin imprints into our adult life, and then we project them onto a fictional character called God, who isn't really there, but we ascribe to that being those two qualities. That God nurtures and loves and cares for us, but he could kill us at any second with cancer or a drunk driver in the intersection. And that is where our belief in God comes from, Freud argues. Yeah, look, Freud, we would call this reductionism. You know, Freud reduces all religion to a kind of neurosis. So I don't know where you are again on the atheism to theism spectrum, but Freud makes a powerful argument. Let's at least give him this piece that here in a college class where our job is to try on all these different ways of thinking, these different perspectives, and critically examine them. Let me ask you a question. What if Freud's right? What if we've invented the whole damn thing? No, there's a God. And Freud's like, well, I know you want there to be one, right? So Freud's kind of an exciting antagonistic moment in our study of world religions. He's not having it. So let me get to the third figure on our list of five, and his name is William James. I mentioned him a moment ago. He's a psychologist also. He's an American. He's also a philosopher. And in 1900, he convened a gathering in Edinburgh, Scotland, of all the leading luminaries in the social sciences, sociology, anthropology, psychology. And it was a conference on religious experience. And James made a powerful argument to his colleagues in the behavioral sciences. He said, we have not taken religion seriously enough. We need to start studying religious experience very carefully. There's something going on that we need to understand. Because prior to that, again, the intellectual class had largely ignored religion. It wasn't something to be studied scientifically. But James changes all that. And his series of talks at that conference in 1900 got put together into a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. It's one of the most important books in the field of religious studies, required reading for everybody who becomes a religious studies major, The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. But in that book and elsewhere in his work, James makes this argument, and it's kind of the opposite of Freud in some ways. James argues that religious experience has measurable beneficial outcomes. And James does not take a position on is there a God or is there not a God, or which religion is true. He's not asking those questions. He's saying, as a scientist studying human beings and their behavior and psychology and all that stuff, we have to acknowledge that people with deep religious convictions and people in a religious community have better lives. They measurably are happier. You know, behavioral scientists claim to be able to study things like depression and anxiety and wellness and happiness. And so they're measurably happier. People with strong religious convictions in strong religious community have longer, more stable marriages. Their families are more tightly bound together. They are healthier, physically healthier. They literally live longer. And James is like, we can't ignore this data. We can't ignore the efficaciousness of religion, you know, the effectiveness of religion on human happiness, on human life. I'll just drop one real quick example in here. Some of you may have experience with alcohol and drug recovery. So even a passing acquaintance with it, maybe a parent or a child or a family member has been through this. Or maybe you got a DUI and they made you go to AA meetings for a while. So in the recovery world, as they call it, you know, in the 12-step recovery world, it's basically kind of a religious process, a spiritual process, where you turn your life over to a higher power and you admit powerlessness. And slowly, with the help of the community around you, you begin to let go of some of your destructive, compulsive disorder. You know, your compulsive drinking or drug using or whatever it is. And so if you have even any experience with that positive dynamic, marriages being put back together, fathers returning to their families, getting clean, getting sober, then you understand James's point. That spiritual programs often, not always of course, but often and by and large have these kinds of measurable positive outcomes in people's lives. And James is like, why aren't we talking more about that? Why are we wasting all our time arguing about, is there a God or is there not a God? James wants to measure outcomes, measure results. And by the way, one last piece on James. He's not just studying Christianity or Judaism or Islam. He's studying people of all faith paths. Buddhist monks and how nuns pray and mystical experiences and enlightenment experiences and all of that stuff. So the fourth guy on our list is Rudolf Otto. And Otto is a German theologian, and his scope is narrow. He's focusing really just on the Bible, Judeo-Christian, and maybe Islamic, certainly just Western religion. And Otto tries to answer the question this way. The origin of religion always comes back down to one guy, a Moses, an Abraham, a Jesus, a Buddha, a Muhammad. There's some dude that has some breakthrough experience. You know, Buddha, now I'm adding the Eastern guys in. He didn't really do that, but what the heck. You know, Buddha meditating under the Bodhi tree and becoming enlightened. But the examples that Otto's focusing on are things like Moses, you know, the burning bush, God appearing to Moses and saying, go to Egypt and let my people go. And that's where Judaism really comes from. Moses is the first Jew, many say. So Otto's claim is that religion comes from one guy, kind of a prophet guy, who has this breakthrough experience, which Otto calls the numinous experience, from the Latin word numen, for spirit. Finally, Carl Jung, and Jung is an interesting take. We could do a whole lecture on Jung, but and we'll mention some of his work in the next video. But briefly, and just to wrap up our work today, Jung was a colleague of Freud, in some ways a protege. You know, Freud was the mentor in some respects. And so Jung also comes from the medical field, and he's also interested in psychotherapy and psychology. But Jung and Freud have one of the most famous intellectual breakups around this question of the value of mythology and religion. As we've already noticed, Freud ditched the whole thing. But Jung goes the other way. Jung studies mythology and religion, particularly Hinduism, by the way. Fell in love with the Indian traditions. More on that later. And Jung, as Jung studied world mythology, he began to notice, and he wasn't the only guy, but we're focusing on him. He began to notice that wherever you go in the world, as you read mythology and religion, you begin to notice certain common universal themes, images, even whole narratives in two cultures that had no contact with each other. And Jung begins to hypothesize that maybe, how can we explain this? Maybe there is within us a collective unconscious, an area of our mind that we're not aware of. That idea he shared with Freud. But for Jung, it's a collective unconscious. And out of our collective unconscious comes up all of these universal archetypes and ideas that then take on local form in imagery drawn from our environment and from our sociology. We talked about that last time. But underneath all of the myths and religions of the world are a relatively small set of universal archetypal ideas. And those he calls archetypes. And therefore, Jung argues finally, that studying religion and mythology just might be the most important topic of all, because it lets us read the language of the collective unconscious and gives us deep insights into the human psyche, the human soul. And so religion for Jung at its best helps us develop into our higher selves, into our more evolved self. So there's my little quick sketch of these 5 prominent theories on the origin and purpose of religion. When the video wraps up here in a second, go ahead and click on over to our discussion thread in this module and make your first stab at this. Which of these 5 theories is the closest to your views and why? So let's leave that there, and in our next video, we're going to move into some of those Jungian ideas. We're going to talk about the archetypes further as we think more deeply about religion in the next video. See you on the other side.